Your Excellency, President of the Hellenic Republic, Your Excellency, Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We have with us the representative of the Archbishop of Athens and all Greece, the vice speakers of the House of Parliament, representatives of the political parties in Parliament, the heads of the Greek delegation at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the ambassador of Cyprus to Greece, the head of the Council of State, representatives of the armed forces, and their excellencies, the ambassadors of foreign countries to Greece. My name is Katerina Panagopoulou. I'd like to welcome you to the main cultural event held on the occasion of the assumption of the chairmanship of the Council of Europe. The columns of the Olympian Zeus symbolize a place of worship, but also a universal need of human societies to overcome obstacles and threats and to resolve differences through common values and cohesive myths. Our society faced a great crisis. We were able to remain standing, and we were able to become a role model for the rest of the world because we handled the pandemic in an exemplary manner, and praise was piled upon us by the foreign press. But during a pandemic such as this one, it's not that human lives are being tested. The rule of law is also being tested, as well as human rights and democracy itself. And these are the themes that are at the very core, if you like, of the Greek chairmanship. But this year is an important year because it is the 70th anniversary from the signing of the European Convention on Human Rights on the 4th of November 1950. Regarding the priorities of the Greek chairmanship, I would like to invite to the podium the alternate Minister for Foreign Affairs and Chairman of the Committee of the Council of Europe, Miltiadis Varvitsiotis. You have the floor, Minister. Thank you. Your Excellency, President of the Hellenic Republic, Your Excellency, Prime Minister, dear colleagues in the Parliament and in government, heads of the armed forces, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, honorable ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. There have been successive crises in the last decade, and they have tested our common home, i.e., we're talking about the migratory crisis, the financial crisis, the crisis facing the rule of law. And the answer to these successive crises cannot be anything but the fact that we need more Europe. Not more Europe in the sense that we normally talk about, i.e. the EU of the 27. This is our common home, and this is the economic union and political union. But Europe is a place where we must safeguard and promote common values. It's a beacon for cooperation and for people to rally behind common causes. There is no other institution at a global level which better represents this than the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is the main guardian of democracy, of the rule of law, and of human rights. It is the place for dialogue. 47 member states get together. These 47 member states share the same legal culture in Europe, and they rally behind the principles supporting the 840 million citizens. So the assumption of the chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe by Greece came at a moment when all the values are being tested. And for the first time in world history, we decided to put to the fore protection of life. We put it over economic activity. This means that restrictions were imposed, unprecedented restrictions when it came to human freedom, restriction of movement, restriction of access to work, access to justice, and also implementing fundamental human rights and freedoms. So, for us, the moral, if you like, ground is for us to show the true content of these values that I just mentioned. This is why the main theme is protection of human life and public health in the era of the pandemic, and the effective management of a sanitary crisis while fully respecting human rights and the principles of democracy and the rule of law. Because why the sanitary crisis? The sanitary crisis cannot be an excuse. It cannot be an alibi. We cannot cancel out the rule of law and human rights. These principles, these values must be our guiding light in these difficult times. And according to these principles, restriction of human freedoms must be governed by proportionality. They must be temporary and absolutely necessary, and must be constantly under review. At the same time, protection and access to public health care must be a sine qua non. It's not something that we must try to find. It must be a given. So at the end of the Greek Chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers, what we want is to have the declaration signed in the 133rd session on the 4th of November. So we want all these principles to be accepted in a common text, though. So for the first time, we will have the production of such a text, and its adoption will be a new key in the field of human rights. This will be an important legacy for the prosperity of the next generations, and it will be a moral compass in order for us to deal with similar situations in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, the fight for protection of human rights is a daily struggle. It never ends. It doesn't end with the end of the pandemic, and it doesn't end after adopting the Athens Declaration. This is why we need to be vigilant. Society as a whole must be vigilant. Politicians, the judiciary, the academic community, but also civil society and all responsible citizens. So from this podium, please allow me to actually make a plea. Let us all work together. Let us all be united in order for us to be able to achieve this element. And I believe that all citizens must do their best in order for us to achieve this objective. Ladies and gentlemen, in this very city, 2,500 years ago, there was another pandemic. And this pandemic led to the beginning of the end of the Athenian democracy. That pandemic was a precedent. And it has to do with how the greatest form of democracy in the world may also be led to decline and collapse. In Greece, we've won this battle, the battle of life, but also the battle of democracy. The fact that the Hellenic Parliament continued to work non-stop. And we know, of course, that these measures were accepted. They were considered legitimate. Everything was discussed at the plenary session of Parliament. And I'm talking about the restrictive measures that were put in place. But let us not forget our fellow citizens that lost their lives because of the COVID-19. And let us not forget the personal sacrifice by all our fellow citizens. So we can safely say that we are proud of how Greece managed the crisis. So Greece was considered a good example, an example of effective management of COVID-19. This means that we have assumed our responsibility. Of course, we'd like to pay tribute to the thousands of people who lost their lives during the pandemic. And I'd also like to say that many people are still being tested. So we're here to send a resounding message, the message that if we work together and if we have common principles, then we'll be able to face the storm. We'll be able to face the crisis. Our Europe must not go back to the past. It must not backtrack. It must not close its borders, and it must not go back to national policies. We have to keep the windows open, the windows to the rest of the world. And Greece is present and willing to contribute in order for us to achieve our goal. So with these few thoughts, I'd like to welcome you to the main cultural event held by the Greek Chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. And now I would like us to enjoy afterwards great artists to honor us with their presence, and there will be a beautiful music event afterwards. But before we listen to the musicians, I'd like to invite Her Excellency, the President of the Hellenic Republic, Mrs. Katerina Sakellaropoulou, to share with us her thoughts. And I'm sure that she will actually show how important it is for Greece to undertake, to assume rather, the chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. Thank you very much. You have the floor, Madam President. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this event organized by the Greek Chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. We're truly pleased because after the easing of the restrictive measures, the event is being held live in the presence of the ambassadors of the member states of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe has played a distinctive role in consolidating democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in post-war Europe. Only 3 months after the founding of the Council in August 1949, Greece became a member, and since then has uninterruptedly cooperated with the Council's statutory organs, save for the time of the dictatorship. Eminent personalities represent Greece in the independent institutions of the Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly, the European Court of Human Rights, the Venice Commission, thus ensuring an effective channel of communication and interaction in the fields of politics and law. Constant cooperation with the committees for the prevention of torture and inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, combating of discrimination and racism, and the adoption of anti-corruption policies has proven both constructive and beneficial. It is a happy coincidence that the 4th of November 2020, the day on which the 70th anniversary of the signing of the most iconic text of the Council of Europe, the European Convention on Human Rights, will be celebrated, falls under the Greek chairmanship. Prior to the 1975 Constitution, the European Convention on Human Rights had not been given sufficient attention by the Greek legal order. After the restoration of democracy in our country, the Convention gradually entered legal reasoning and is now an integral part of legal practice. This dialogue between the national judge and the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights revealed major deficits in our national legislation, particularly in the areas of delivery of justice, freedom of expression, detention conditions, and religious freedom. The Convention reshaped administrative practices. It influenced the role of the legislator and even informally changed the very text of our Constitution. Furthermore, it strengthened our ties with the rest of Europe and played a pedagogical role in the sense that it taught us how to better respect the rights of minorities and identities, thereby covering many aspects of self-determination, gender, sexual orientation, and private life. Greece adopted the European acquis on human rights, but also contributed with the peculiarities of its own constitution to enriching the legal order of the Council of Europe and making it more pluralistic. The pandemic has redefined the Council's priorities and the themes chosen by the Greek chairmanship. The key theme is the protection of human life and public health in a pandemic situation, effective management of a health crisis in full respect of human rights and the principles of democracy and the rule of law. A theme which, under such emergency circumstances, is fully in line with the missions and values of the Council of Europe. The successive crises in the last decade have shaken the solid foundations of democracy and the rule of law in Europe. The economic crisis significantly affected social rights and benefits provided by the state in the sectors of healthcare, education, and social security. The latest large-scale recession in Europe stoked the fires of populism and Euroscepticism. The refugee and migration crisis in turn brought disintegrative tendencies and fomented nationalism. The fault lines in European cosmopolitanism grow deeper, and the ideal of a united Europe has faded as people are lulled by national protectionism into a false sense of security. Many seriously underestimate liberal democracy, the legacy of the Enlightenment in Europe, which is served by European institutions such as the Council of Europe. The pandemic has only made contrasts starker. Throughout Europe, there is rising concern about public health and popular prosperity. Protection of human life and health is the bedrock upon which our social charter was built, the fundamental agreement between those in government and the citizens. It forms the basis of political and social life. The virus reminded us of the value and universal nature of public services. The state has once again regained its status in our collective conscience as the most powerful guarantor of our life and liberty. Greece has become a role model for the rest of the world because of the way it handled this public health crisis. We trusted the experts, organized and strengthened our national health system, and thanks to the tireless efforts of the medical and nursing staff, we limited fatalities to the greatest extent possible. It wasn't just the state that set a good example. Society as a whole followed suit. Everyone showed discipline and adhered to the strict measures imposed. Solidarity was offered to vulnerable groups, and frontline workers exhibited self-sacrifice. The pandemic was and is a lesson in ethics and politics. We came to realize that every action we take in such emergency situations does not only affect us, it also affects others and even protects them. We saw that when the state acts wisely and operates according to a plan, it lives up to our expectations and rallies the nation behind a common cause. European societies were hit hard by the pandemic. Sanctity of life is non-negotiable in our civilization, where every life lost is unique. European countries did not all suffer equally. Italy and Spain found themselves in the eye of the storm, counting many confirmed cases and thousands of deaths, with the virus spreading faster. But the heart-wrenching scenes of people in despair and unburied bodies we saw from hospitals were not merely pictures of people in Spain and Italy. They were pictures of Europeans, pictures of all of us. The pandemic made clear that international and supranational coordination is required to handle the crisis. Our common vulnerability to the virus has highlighted the infinite possibilities for cooperation between states and international organizations. From the very first moment, members of the scientific community joined forces in a tireless race for the vaccine and the cure. Vigilance at the international and national level ensured the unobstructed movement of food, medicines, and medical supplies. The Eurozone demonstrated quick institutional reflexes and took relief measures to provide material support to the population in a timely manner. Fiscal discipline rules were loosened. The new funding package did a lot more than just inject liquidity. It provided optimism. It showed solidarity. It gave us hope for our European future. This move proved wrong those who rushed once again to predict the collapse of Europe, underestimating its power and the dynamics of the bonds that hold us together, European bonds. So in the aftermath of the pandemic, first priority will be to reduce inequality and make sure that citizens achieve autonomy in meeting their material needs. The political response to alleviate the consequences of the pandemic is to revitalize the lung of democracy, that is, to safeguard social mobility of European citizens, particularly of young people who see their life prospects dwindling or being frustrated because of high unemployment and weak economic growth. Europe cannot withstand another protracted recession. The main aims of the Greek chairmanship include a strong democratic element. They are clearly developmental and social in character and exhibit the strong political will, to support and give impetus to younger generations, as they are the ones that will give shape and form to our common European future. In this new pandemic environment, preventive measures restricting our freedom of movement have a horizontal effect. They impact on work, education, and communication. State and society are undergoing transformation and rapidly entering the digital era. The Greek chairmanship is not only, from a technical point of view, a digital chairmanship that will make smart use of online events and conference calls. Digital technology is our most powerful counterweight to the crisis. One of the core priorities of the chairmanship is to familiarize children and young adults with the fundamental values of Europe and democratic culture through the use of all modern digital technologies. Education is the driving force of democracy and active citizenship. This, however, requires providing our youth with the appropriate cognitive skills to develop their IT skills on the basis of self-determination. Promoting democratic pluralism and an open public sphere does not, of course, mean tolerating misinformation and fake news, which proliferate, particularly in times of crisis, and shift the public debate. Educational policy is part of a broader European program on the protection of minors as a vulnerable group. Protection against poverty, violence, human trafficking, forced labor, and all forms of exploitation. Greece has shouldered the main burden of receiving large refugee and migrant flows, including many unaccompanied minors. Children that have suffered traumatic experiences because of abandonment and the war that is ravaging their countries. It is our duty to offer them material and psychological support in suitable accommodation facilities. It is also our duty to take full advantage of the digital opportunities offered during this crisis to speed up registration and asylum procedures, thus reducing the time children and migrants spend in administrative detention. We delve deeper into our common European conscience and strengthen it further by protecting our rich cultural heritage against another modern threat, a pandemic in slow motion, as it has been aptly called, climate change. Archeological sites, cultural symbols which attest to our origins and common trajectory in European space and time, are at the mercy of extreme weather conditions for which we bear sole responsibility. The integrity of monuments and historical places is under threat, and if they are damaged, our collective memory will also be shattered. Scientists and international environmental organizations have sounded the alarm. Climate change, along with other environmental disruptions, may provide fertile ground for the emergence of new infectious diseases like COVID-19, and it may also change their transmission model. We are running out of time to raise environmental awareness. We all have witnessed the isolation and abandonment caused by the pandemic, but we've also noticed the reduction of the pollution levels and the refreshing of waters on the planet. The pandemic brought us back, albeit dramatically, to a life where there was less squandering of energy. Clean and sustainable development policies do not only guarantee the material integrity of our monuments, but also ensure the immaterial dimension of our daily lives, our cultural way of life. The Green Deal is our roadmap to a climate-neutral Europe by 2050. It contains actions to restore biodiversity, reduce pollution, and make efficient use of resources, thus paving the way for a clean, circular economy. It is true that when there is a pandemic, we're all at risk. Some of us, however, are more vulnerable than others. Vulnerable groups, however, are not only determined by biological factors, age, or the underlying diseases of people who experience this risky situation with greater intensity. The public health care system has rightly given them absolute priority to bring the number of casualties down to as close to zero as possible. However, we're also surrounded by socially vulnerable fellow citizens, those who suffer the most from the pandemic and the measures restricting their freedom, be it physical, professional, and finally social. One of the main aims of the Greek chairmanship is to combat discrimination. Cases when public or private discourse diverges and becomes directly or indirectly racist. Family violence, which is exacerbated in conditions of confinement. Stigmatization of minorities, where the pandemic is used as a pretext. The protection of the social state is equally important. Preventive care in the form of screening tests to detect the virus and measures restricting movement were the immediate response by the state when the crisis broke out. In the long term, however, these solutions need to be complemented by the welfare state in the form of welfare benefits. What comes first is targeted support to socially vulnerable groups, the unemployed, the most deprived, single parents, people with disabilities, inhabitants of remote, mountainous, or insular areas. Providing support to businesses and employees for whom physical distancing is not an option, supporting tourism and seasonal work. Equal access to public goods and protection of labor rights in a society battered by the crisis constitute a safety net for many people and guarantee social cohesion. These are European matters of the highest order, which is why one of the aims of the Greek chairmanship is to promote the implementation of the European Social Charter. As the crisis unfolds, predictions by international organizations such as the International Labour Organization, the ILO, are very bleak. Global unemployment is expected to rise to even higher levels than those of the 2008 crisis. Social protection is not only linked to the adjustment and implementation of labor legislation, but also to a viable transformation of the economy and the use of the digital model of remote working to the benefit of society, businesses, and employees. Many opportunities and challenges appear before us. New digital networks and energy infrastructure, the development of electronic services, such as the promotion of software for remote working, electronic money and digital signatures, and many more. The social state is being reinvented according to the digital triptych of labor, health, education, with a promotion of teleworking, biogenetics, AI, and teleeducation. Our world in the post-COVID-19 period should not be a world of stark inequality, with a digital divide separating the digitally literate from the electronically illiterate. On the contrary, Europe should act in an inclusive and unifying manner. It should try to bridge differences and smooth them out. The challenge facing Europe and the Greek chairmanship is also institutional. Independence of institutions, particularly justice, is at the core of the rule of law and among the top priorities of the Greek semester. Europe is first and foremost a union of law, with justice being effective and impartial. Democracy and popular sovereignty cannot exist without the rule of law, the independent courts, and the checks and balances that guarantee protection of minorities and prevent from the tyranny of the majority. This promotes the quality of democracy. It increases citizens' trust in the state and in European legal order, which shares common rules and values. The judiciary is in a dialogue with politics through the review of the constitutionality of laws, but does not depend on it or its political agendas. It remains the guardian of legality and social peace. The independence of judicial bodies is directly linked to the judge's mission and constitutes an essential element of the right to effective judicial protection and a fair trial. The appointment and tenure of the members of the judiciary, particularly in supreme courts, the autonomous exercise of their duties, and their imperviousness to interference by external interests, do not just safeguard the delivery of justice. They act as a shield for democratic institutions and their representation to the citizens. Having served As a Supreme Court judge myself for many years and President of the Council of State, I would like to assure you that citizens perceive justice not as something abstract, nor as the mouthpiece of the law, as Montesquieu once said, a law that is often complex or even irrational and ignored by the citizens. Justice is their last resort for a judgment that is fair and impartial. It is an institution they turn to in the hope of acquiring equality and freedom when they feel wronged. The pandemic will bring, or rather has already brought along with it, new challenges in the area of legislation. Judges will be called upon to rule on the law regarding COVID-19, this time the law of sanitary need. It is clear that when confronted with contemporary populist ideologies across the political spectrum, justice reserves the privilege of sobriety and reference to the rule. The rule of law and liberal democracy are a historical and cultural achievement of Europe. The Supreme Courts, the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Human Rights have played a decisive role in this regard by defending the values of European modernity. The pandemic has not only been an unprecedented public health crisis for all of us, it has also been a major political test. Problems facing institutions and societies in Europe were precipitated. The most vulnerable and fragile aspects of our coexistence were brought to the surface. The crisis became a catalyst for economic, social, and political developments which we cannot yet fully grasp, or the outcome of which is unpredictable. Procrastination in establishing a European political union, the democratic deficit, and the crisis of the welfare state were here long before the virus struck. There is now an even more imperative need for a paradigm shift in our coexistence in Europe towards an open society, not just financially but also culturally, a society with a robust, human-centered character. A European society that fosters equal opportunities and inclusion, not exclusion and division. A new Europe will emerge in the wake of the pandemic. A wind of pessimism about the future prospects of Europe may be now blowing across the continent, and the voices of dissent and introversion may be growing louder, but we all know that Europe is a great place to live in and a privileged way of life on our planet. For Greece, which has struggled in the face of adversity in the last decade, but has remained on its feet thanks to the sacrifices of the Greek people and its EU membership, the assumption of the chairmanship of the Council is a unique opportunity. It will allow the country to showcase its European identity and progress and contribute, especially now, to carving out our common European path and finding a way to exit yet another crisis. Europe's response to these difficult times should not only be to manage the situation and solve financial problems. It requires that we go back to the fundamental ideas envisioned by Europe's founding fathers like Jean Monnet. Important European decisions, meaning those that blaze new trails and broaden our horizons, should be political decisions par excellence. The presidency of the Hellenic Republic will avail of all the appropriate means to actively support the Greek Chairmanship, the activities and events that will be organized during its semester. It's the least we can do as part of our duty to contribute to the work of the Council of Europe, the promotion of its values, its rules, and its institutional acquis at this critical crossroads of our European future. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam President. Now we will move on to the musical part. We will first listen from Stelios Kerasidis. He was, I heard the isolation waltz. It was during the quarantine, and I thought this is yet another child playing the piano. But when I listened to him play, I was in awe. And I think that you will hear this. You'll see that when this young boy actually plays the piano, he is transformed. He played in Carnegie Hall when he was 5 years old in New York. Then he played at the Royal Albert Hall in London, and he has many prizes and awards. And the Isolation Waltz was on BBC World on the 8 o'clock news. Right after Stelios Kerasidis, we'll listen to Eugenia Papadima. She was a child prodigy. She has won many awards, many distinctions. So together with Isidros Sideris has participated in many international master classes. He is a permanent member of the Athens State Orchestra. So let us listen to them and enjoy their performance. Thank you very much. Wonderful melodies. Let me say that the cultural event of the Hellenic presidency is a tribute to human beings. We walk through history, we honor our past, we forge a future based on our strengths, on freedom and public discourse, free speech. We will conclude after listening to the Woodwind Quintet of the Athens State Orchestra. The musicians are Dimitris Vamvas, Spiros Mourikis, Alexandros Ikonomou, and Kostas Siskos. So we will listen to them. And we have now come to the end of this event. I'd like to thank those of you who came. Just one request, because COVID-19 is present, let us leave while keeping the necessary distances. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.